Okay, so the topic of this evening's talk pertains to a particular version of the moral argument for God's existence. As you probably know, there are various moral arguments for God's existence, and I don't mean various arguments for God's existence, of course that's true, but I actually mean various moral arguments for God's existence, along with one very highly influential moral argument against God's existence, the problem of evil. Argument against God's existence, or at least God's goodness. At any rate, morality can also be used to argue for things other than God's existence. It can be used, as it was famously by Kant, in an argument for immortality. Though I don't like that argument. I do believe in immortality. I just don't think his particular argument works. But I'm not going to talk about that. So the general structure of the various moral arguments in favor of God's existence is similar. Most all of them tend to start with some important moral phenomenon, be it moral regrets or moral freedom, moral obligations or moral rights or moral goodness, the value of human persons, our need for moral transformation or forgiveness or ultimate perfection, or the reality of moral knowledge. And then they inquire into whether the resources of theism provide a robust explanation of the phenomenon in question, and perhaps even a better explanation than what can be provided by secular accounts. If such a case can be made, then the argument is thought to provide distinctively moral reasons to take theism seriously. Those reasons may not be enough to make theism more likely true than false. If they could, that would be what Richard Swinburne calls a P-inductive argument. But at the least, they may provide reasons for theism to be more likely than it would otherwise be, and that's what Swinburne calls a C-inductive argument. So to get this discussion underway, let's first talk about what knowledge is, then extend the discussion to moral knowledge in particular, and then we can ask if we have good reason to think that we have such moral knowledge, and next consider an important objection to the idea of moral knowledge, so-called debunking objections. Finally, we will consider whether, and perhaps how, theism and its resources might inform the discussion and maybe even show promise to address this objection effectively, and thereby bolster our confidence that we possess moral knowledge after all. Knowledge comes in different forms. We speak of competence knowledge, like how to ride a bike, or acquaintance knowledge, like I know such and such a person, like I know Adam, or I know Chicago or something. But the form of knowledge that is of most interest to us this evening is propositional knowledge. Which is to say, knowledge of propositions. It's knowledge that. I know that twice 2 is 4, for example. Or I know that Joe Biden is president. When I say a proposition, I'm referring to something said about the world that is either true or false. This is its truth value, whether it's true or false. We may or may not know the truth value of a particular proposition, but the idea is that every proposition has a truth value, is true or false. So, to say we know a proposition is to say 3 things. First, we believe the proposition, and there's much that we could say about what belief consists in, but I'll put that to the side for now. Second, the proposition in question has to be true, presumably by corresponding with the way reality actually is. We cannot know something false, for example. Of course, we can know that something is false, but we can't know something false, like I can't know that twice 2 is 5, right? That kind of thing. And then third, we need to add something to true beliefs that renders them items of knowledge for us. We need some third component, and some call this justification, some call it warrant. for now, we'll go with this idea of justification, by which we mean something like evidence. So suppose that you believe that there are extraterrestrial intelligences out there, and suppose that you are right. So you have a true belief, right, in that case, but do you have knowledge? Well, presumably only if you have the right sort of evidence, and enough evidence for the true belief. It's not, for example, merely a lucky guess. There's no shortage of discussion over this matter of justification, whether and how much it is needed, whether something else is needed for knowledge, whether the justification has to be of a certain type. But for present purposes, we can think of knowledge as at least in the vicinity of a justified true belief, and we'll set some of those questions to the side, and now we can turn our attention specifically to moral knowledge. So to qualify knowledge as moral is to delimit the scope of its content. Since morality involves questions of values and principles of conduct, good and bad, right and wrong, vice and virtue, moral knowledge claims might look like this. Lying for purposes of self-aggrandizement is wrong. Torturing children for the sheer fun of it is morally evil. Integrity is a laudable virtue. And I just added this one. Sucker punching Chris Rock at the Oscars is wrong. Judging that we know such propositions then, and to be correct in our claim, 1, we have to believe them, 2, they have to be true, and 3, we have to be adequately justified in believing them. Again, I will set aside the belief requirement, except to say very briefly that our actions, more than our words alone, are probably the better measure of our beliefs, and that's well worth considering, but I'm not going to discuss it. Regarding the second requirement, that the propositions be true, we will, for present purposes, largely assume this to be so. This is to say that I'm going to largely assume something like moral realism, objective moral truth. I'm not going to argue in its favor. That would be a whole different discussion. If you reject that assumption, of course, then you would also reject moral knowledge predicated on it, right? That's clear. At any rate, like I said before, this particular lecture is not so much a foray into moral metaphysics. So as such, I'm less arguing for moral realism as presupposing it. Moral realism is this view that there are robust, objective moral truths. So that's enough on that one. But what I want to direct your attention to is this third component of moral knowledge pertaining to justification. So again, just another word on this matter of moral realism. If someone were inclined to deny moral realism, perhaps by adopting what's called error theory in metaethics, or expressivism, or constructivism, that would be a way to deny moral knowledge, at least moral knowledge of the sort that I'm discussing this evening. And that's a slide where I briefly encapsulate the meaning of those rival metaethical theories. Whether such non-realist accounts can do justice, though, to our pre-theoretical intuitions about morality is a fascinating question and a big question, but it's not so much the focus of our current inquiry, though the matter is not altogether avoidable, as we'll see. I'm actually writing a book on that very topic. There's so much to cover, so I just have to keep delimiting what I'm talking about tonight. Where we do want to focus our attention, our discussion for now, is that third requirement of moral knowledge, again, the matter of justification. Legitimate moral knowledge claims must feature, arguably at least, reasons to believe the propositions. They need adequate evidence or justification to believe them, and it's to this matter of justification that we're going to now turn. So are we adequately justified to believe in at least some of our moral judgments? Obviously, not every knee-jerk and spontaneous moral assessment that we make is well evidenced and sufficiently thoughtful, particularly on deeply vexed and complex moral questions involving a conflict of moral intuitions. But what about what seem to be eminently clear and central moral beliefs that are practically non-negotiable? It is wrong to torture children for fun, for example. That's sort of the stock example. Are we adequately justified to believe such a proposition as that? Again, to avoid biting off more than we can chew, let's assume that some moral propositions are true. If they're all false, we clearly cannot have knowledge of them, so game over. Even if some moral claims are true, however, recall that this is only one of the three conditions that moral knowledge calls for. We have to believe the proposition has to be true, and we need to be justified to believe it. So what case can we make for such justification? I will suggest three possibilities, and they're not mutually exclusive. I actually think the cumulative case that you get when you put them together is stronger. So first, David Enoch makes a case for the justification of moral beliefs in terms of what he dubs their deliberative indispensability. The basic idea is this. Just as something like an abductive inferential pattern and an inference to the best explanation is necessary for our theoretical reasoning, likewise, objectivity about the norms of practical reasoning seems indispensable to our practical deliberation, our deliberation concerning matters of ethics. When engaged in ethical deliberation, for example, we are aiming to get things right, to decide what makes best sense. The basic idea, in light of the shared phenomenology of theoretical and practical reasoning, is that they share a great deal in common. They are both trying to get to a fact of the matter. Even if, as is at least sometimes the case, this effort unavoidably makes appeal to one's own desires, allowing oneself to settle a deliberation by reference to a desire, one is committed to the normative judgment that the relevant desire makes the corresponding action the one that makes sense, if not the most sense. As Enoch puts it, so even with desires at hand, you still commit yourself to a normative truth. This, though, is not yet enough to justify our convictions about objective moral facts. Why think such objectivity, at least, is sometimes necessary? Arguably, the question of justification shows itself to be an especially obstinate consideration when it comes to deliberating on our desires, as it happens. It is pretty implausible to claim, Angus Ritchie writes, that the only thing I ever do when reflecting on my desires is to discern my own all things considered desire. My deliberation also involves considering whether my desires are excessively self-centered or shallow, and how they ought to be weighed against the desires and needs of others. It looks as if I am trying to get something right and trying to revise my desires in the light of the fact of the matter about what is or is not right. Still, there could be objective norms of practical reasoning without such norms being distinctively moral, but at the least, for now, we can make the following observation. If we were to reduce all of our moral judgments to involve sentiments, preferences, and conventions, and never robustly objective moral claims, it could not help but affect our first-order moral attitudes. Ronald Dworkin captures this insight when he writes, "The claim that abortion," this is his particular example, "is objectively wrong, that claim seems equivalent to ordinary discourse, to the claim that abortion would still be wrong even if no one thought it was. I mean that abortion is just plain wrong. not wrong only because people think it is, end quote. So my first go at arguing for the justification of at least some of our moral claims has to do with the demands of practical deliberation, which seem to have deep resonances with deliberation in theoretical matters. A second tactic or strategy to account for moral justification is this. Many epistemologists, following a modified foundationalist model of knowledge, suggest that there are certain beliefs of ours that rightly function as the foundation of the rest of our knowledge. These foundational beliefs can be called basic beliefs, which are non-inferential, which is to say that we do not infer them on the basis of other beliefs. Beliefs that we do thus infer from other beliefs are in what's called the superstructure of our beliefs. They're not the basic and foundational ones. Our foundational or basic beliefs are known more directly without the need for discursive inference. They are, at least on what's called the classical model of foundationalism, self-evident, evident to the senses, or incorrigible. They don't lack justification, but their justification does not come from other beliefs. If you want to know the fancy word for that, they are non-doxastic. Non-doxastic, isn't that nice? An example here might help. Suppose I see a cloud in the sky. I'm justified to believe it and may well know it, that there's a cloud there, not because I'm making an inference, but simply because the belief that there is this cloud formed within me in the right sort of way. So what's called a properly basic belief is a basic belief that is formed in some such reliable fashion. So it's both non-inferential and properly justified or warranted. Now, what does this have to do with our axiomatic moral beliefs? When epistemologists found reasons to alter foundationalism from a classical model to a modified model, largely to avoid what's called a self-referential incoherence problem, the basic commitment of classical foundation kind of failed its own test. It wasn't able to be inferred from anything that we can know in a basic way, and it wasn't itself basic. That's a problem. So to fix that problem, what happened was they sort of opened the door for more propositions to qualify as properly basic. And among such properly basic beliefs may well, many of them think, be something like certain of our moral convictions. After all, they seem to be about as sure as any of our other beliefs. And in fact, we are hard-pressed to identify yet more basic beliefs by which to ground our centralmost and most obvious moral convictions. So arguably, we have good reasons to accept, say, the wrongness of torturing children for the fun of it. Such a proposition may well qualify as a properly basic belief. And third, consider what some recent epistemologists have called phenomenal conservatism, the view that if it seems to someone, S, that P is true, some proposition is true, then S is prima facie justified in believing that P. So more precisely, if it seems to S that P, then in the absence of defeaters, S is thereby justified in believing that P. Phenomenal conservatism dubs how it seems to S as S's seemings, which refer to experienced mental states with propositional content and a distinct phenomenal character. Seemings, like beliefs, have propositional content in that just as S may believe that P, so it may seem to S that P. But whereas beliefs are true or false and typically corrigible, they potentially are wrong, seemings are veridical or non-veridical and uniformly incorrigible, right? If something seems to you to be the case, then it definitely seems to you to be the case, right? Moreover, seemings have a forceful, phenomenal character. They have a sort of felt veridicality that inclines us to believe their propositional content. Seemings are thus causally and epistemically prior to beliefs in that they support our beliefs. So, given phenomenal conservatism, evidence comes cheap, you might say, so that evidentialism's demand for evidence as a necessary condition of epistemic justification is easy to satisfy. For as long as it seems to S that P, and S has no defeater of how these things seem, S has adequate supporting evidence to believe that P. The application to our moral beliefs is obvious. In moral experience, we have these seemings with moral propositional content, like it's wrong to torture a child for fun. And in the absence of some defeater on phenomenal conservatism, we are justified in holding such moral beliefs. So, considerations concerning deliberative indispensability, proper basicality, and phenomenal conservatism can all plausibly be thought to help supply justification for at least some of our moral judgments, at least the axiomatic ones among them. Combined with objective truth and belief, this would be enough to make moral knowledge possible. But this all depends on the absence of defeaters, especially defeaters for our justification. And what exactly is a defeater? Well, there are two types of defeaters. Yes. Rebutting defeaters, to begin with, which show a belief in question to be false. For example, looking through the window and seeing that the sky is clear is evidence for the belief that it is not raining outside. So that particular perception provides a rebutting defeater of the belief that it is raining. Do you see? Undercutting defeaters are a little different, right? They show a belief in question to lack justification, though it still may turn out to be true. For example, suppose I see a horse in the room right now, but then I find out that you had administered to me a pill that makes me see horses, you know. Well, in that case, I have an undercutting defeater for my belief that there is a horse in the room, even though it may turn out that there is a horse in the room, but that seems unlikely. Still, I lack justification to believe it, you see. It's an undercutting defeater. So in the next and penultimate section of this paper, what I want to do is lay out one of the more important potential undercutting defeaters of moral knowledge that challenges our justification to believe even what seem to us to be the most obvious of moral truths, like it's wrong to torture children for fun. The defeater in question is the so-called evolutionary debunking objection. So let's begin briefly with this topic of evolution and what it is. In a more recent book entitled Where the Conflict Really Lies, philosopher Alvin Plantinga helpfully illuminates this matter by drawing a few distinctions. He identifies a cluster of ideas often associated with evolution. 1, the ancient Earth thesis. 2, the progress thesis. This is the notion that life has progressed from relatively simple to relatively complex forms. 3, the thesis of descent with modification. 4, the common ancestry thesis. 5, the claim that there is a naturalistic mechanism driving this process of descent with modification, something like natural selection operating on random genetic mutation. And 6, the naturalistic origins thesis, the idea that life itself developed from non-living matter without any special creative activity of God, but just by virtue of processes described by the ordinary laws of physics and chemistry. Can I just go off script for a moment and tell you a little story about my mother? My mother used to always make me laugh, and this was one of those occasions. So she was a very strong Christian, and she was not a fan of the idea of evolution. And so I said to her one time, I love to do this with her sometimes. So I'd say, so Mom, can you be a Christian and believe in evolution? And she thought for a second, and then she goes, no. And then I said, well, what about C.S. Lewis? And she said, what about C.S. Lewis? And I said, well, he was a Christian and he believed in evolution. And then she said this, I'm not talking about C.S. Lewis, I'm talking about evolution. This helps explain why I went into philosophy, I think, being raised with this. She was delightful. I lost her a few years ago, and I miss her terribly, but yeah, she was no fan of evolution. She would probably be rather upset I'm talking about it at the moment. Yeah, likewise, the first book I ever did was on Harry Potter, and I could never live that one down either, because she would be like, I just don't understand why you're dealing with that devil stuff. She was delightful. Anyway, enjoy your parents while you got them. You lose them, and then you realize how precious. Anyway, Plantinga employs the locution evolution then to denote the first four of those theses that we just looked at, the first four. And then the term Darwinism to include commitment to natural selection as the underlying mechanism of evolution. All right? And so we're largely talking about something like Darwinism tonight. But that final thesis, the naturalistic origins thesis, he notes, is not actually really part of the theory of evolution. The notion that evolution is an unguided process, in other words, is but what he dubs a theological add-on. Plantinga rejects this notion that evolution entails an unguided process, opting instead to leave whether or not the evolutionary process was guided an open question. So let's proceed, following Plantinga here, on the assumption that this is what evolution involves. Old Earth, the progress thesis, descent with modification, common ancestry thesis, and even this naturalistic mechanism operating on random mutation. But we will treat the naturalistic origins thesis as less a component of evolution than a naturalistic supplement to evolution, okay? So we're not going to assume it's built into the notion of evolution that it was an unguided process. On the assumption, nor are we going to assume that it was a guided process. We're just leaving that to the side. We're not taking a position on that yet. On the assumption of something like Darwinian evolution, then, the question becomes, does such a picture provide reasons to cast our moral knowledge in doubt? In other words, does it provide something of an undercutting defeater for moral knowledge? Some have argued that the answer is yes. Advancing so-called evolutionary debunking arguments, or EDAs, evolutionary debunking arguments, to make their case, and I'm going to show you what these look like. Evolutionary debunking arguments. They generally look something like this. Premise 1. Darwinian forces have had a pervasive influence on our moral beliefs. We can call this the empirical premise. The empirical premise. Premise 2. If 1, then our moral beliefs have greatly diminished epistemic status or are completely debunked, if they're so rooted in this process of evolution. So, the conclusion, our moral beliefs have greatly diminished epistemic status or are completely debunked, which is to say that evolution on this argument is effectively undermined, undercut. Okay? So, turning our attention to the empirical premise that Darwinian forces have had a pervasive influence on our moral beliefs, let me mention just two contemporary prominent debunkers. First, Richard Joyce, who offers a book-length treatment of the evolutionary genealogy of our moral faculties and beliefs. He acknowledges that it's beyond the capability of researchers to say exactly how natural selection has worked to bring about our moral sense, but that the evidence is compelling that in one way or another it has. The evidence is compelling to say that in one way or another it has. Again, he's got a whole book on it, and I just summarized it in one sentence, so you get that I'm kind of flying high here. Perhaps because of the caffeine. Okay. Even more than Joyce, Sharon Street has garnered the most attention of all as a debunker in a piece, a very famous piece that she wrote called A Darwinian Dilemma for Realist Theories of Value. She begins with our evaluative judgments and works backwards. Specifically, she posits that certain kinds of evaluative judgments, such as endangering one's own survival and causing harm to one's own kin, would have a quite negative impact on one's success at survival, reproduction. Meanwhile, other kinds of evaluative judgments, such as promoting one's own survival and caring for one's own offspring, would have a correspondingly positive impact on survival and reproductive success. She argues that the fact that so many of our evaluative judgments correspond to what promotes reproductive success, and the absence of judgments which have the opposite tendency, is evidence in favor of the view that natural selection has had a tremendous influence on that content. Among the evolutionary explanations for tendencies towards specific kinds of judgments, Street includes kin selection and reciprocal altruism. Like others, Street considers the observable behavior of many non-human species, particularly higher primates and such, those closer to humans in the evolutionary tree, to be additional evidence of the influence of evolutionary forces on our evaluative tendencies. And she concludes, quote, "We may view many of our evaluative judgments as conscious, reflective endorsements of more basic evaluative tendencies that we share with other animals," end quote. However, she argues that the influence of evolutionary forces on our evaluative judgments is indirect in shaping only our basic evaluative tendencies. Short quote from her, "Other factors can and do influence the judgments that we actually make, including the crucial and sui generis influence of rational reflection that must also be taken into account," end quote. Nevertheless, in setting the stage for her debunking argument, Street maintains that the influence of evolutionary forces on our evaluative judgments is pervasive through the basic underlying tendencies that we have inherited from our evolutionary ancestors and which we share with other creatures. She also argues that the truth of some account very roughly along these lines is all that is required for the Darwinian dilemma to get off the ground. So Joyce and Street both seem to gesture toward the non-negotiable fact that it is inevitable that morality, whatever it exactly amounts to, must invariably find its origin in our evolutionary past. Of that they seem sure, although they admit that the specific and precise mechanisms for how this played out remain a matter of some conjecture. So a strong dose of provisionality is appropriate on that score. The reason for the presumption, by the way, seems to be an assumption that merely possible fine-grained accounts of evolutionary genealogies of morality are enough, even if we're not able to provide those accounts. Why? Because, well, it's really the only game in town, right? Philip Kitcher likely speaks for all of these folks in his characterization of the possibility of an evolutionary genealogy of morality. And you know what I mean by genealogy. It's like an origin story. Where did these things come from? Here's what he wrote. "The principal reason for taking the possibility seriously lies in the difficulty of thinking of serious rivals," right? It's the only etiology in town kind of thing. And elsewhere, Kitcher writes, "Appeals to divine will," this is my first mention of God, "appeals to divine will, or to even a realm of values, to faculties of ethical perception, pure practical reason, all of these things have to go, right? So I want to step back for a moment and make an observation. Recognize that Joyce and Street, like Michael Roos, like Kitcher and others, are all assuming not just evolution, but something like the conjunction of evolution and naturalism. As such, they import the naturalistic origins thesis, remember that from before? That denies divine guidance of the process. They import that assumption into their analysis. And then by their own admission, they think that naturalists, like themselves, are hard-pressed to hold onto moral realism and moral knowledge predicated on it. At least prima facie, this attitude makes it difficult indeed for naturalists to evade the force of the empirical premise. Turning our attention much more briefly now to the epistemic premise, again it says that if Darwinian forces have indeed had a pervasive influence on our moral beliefs, then our moral beliefs have greatly diminished epistemic status or are completely debunked. Joyce's conviction seems to be that a complete non-moral genealogy of moral judgment, which he thinks is possible, is something that, even if not yet achieved, is a realistic goal, and it's something potentially within our reach, and moreover, it's a practical inevitability. And thus, no sort of guiding teleology is allowed, right, on such a naturalistic conception of things, without which a cosmic convergence of our moral judgments and objective moral facts, even assuming that there are such things, is simply a pipe dream. So do you see? This doesn't necessarily require a rejection of moral realism. You can still potentially reject moral knowledge even if there are objective moral facts out there of the most robust kind if we don't have epistemic access to them. As Joyce puts it, broadly speaking, no sensible person can object to evolutionary psychology. And for Joyce, this means that he becomes an error theorist. Every moral claim we make is false, strictly speaking. But he's also something of a fictionalist. Like, it's okay to act like they're true, but they're not actually true. When it comes to morality, he thinks his commitments to evolution and naturalism leave him no choice. Street, likewise, distinguishes between basic evaluative tendencies and full-fledged evaluative judgments, arguing that relentless selective pressure has had a direct and tremendous influence on our basic evaluative tendencies, and these, in turn, have had a major, though not necessarily overriding, indirect effect on our actual moral beliefs or full-fledged evaluative judgments. It's within the scaffolds of our basic moral orientation that all moral reflection takes place. This does leave some room for something like reason, because if I could stop just for a moment and say, many of us think, oh, look, I can just step back from all of this and it's okay, right? Even if evolution shaped me, even if evolution shaped my belief-forming capacities and epistemic faculties and all the rest, that's fine. I can think about it and I can come up with my own conclusions about these moral matters, right? But everything you see is within the context where all of those things were strongly shaped by evolution. And so you're, without feeling like you're constrained by all of these strictures imposed by the evolutionary process. So this leaves room for reason, but to borrow a term from Hume, David Hume, it's reason is the slave of the passions, right? It's merely an instrumental rationality. Even our most non-negotiable moral commitments and judgments have, after all, been shaped by evolution in such a way that they are potentially contaminated to the core. Here's Street along these lines, quote, "If the fund of evaluative judgments with which human reflection began was thoroughly contaminated with illegitimate influence, then the tools of rational reflection were equally contaminated, for the latter are always just a subset of the former." Okay, so it is telling that the two best known proponents of EDAs, naturalists, both of them, take their import to be a rejection of moral realism and of moral knowledge based on it. Joyce adopts, like I say, an error theory and a fictionalist account of morality. Street, as it happens, adopts what is called a version of constructivism. But they both abandon the notion of robust moral realism. And they both rule out knowledge predicated on such a conception. Now, the literature on all of this, as you might imagine, has become quite extensive, and I'm honestly still working my way through it. But there are plenty of naturalist-leaning thinkers who want to argue that the evolutionary debunking case against strong moral realism and knowledge is not decisive. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. I'm not actually going to take a position on that. All I've done is sort of raise the challenge for my naturalist friends at this point. But what I'm going to do in the remainder of this talk, in the last section of this talk, is not discuss those defenses of secular moral realism, except to say that I think they have their hands full with some serious challenges in countering their views. But what I am rather going to do is spend the rest of this talk on the matter of whether theism, supernaturalism, a theistic hypothesis, God, might help diffuse debunking concerns. Okay. Eric Wielenberg, who's a secular ethicist, has noted that more work by theists addressing debunking objections should be done. And this is my intent here, at least to take a step or two in this direction. Note that the arguments so far considered have been predicated on the conviction that Darwinism gives an entire analysis of our moral sentiments, such that nothing more is needed. But the insight of Plantinga's earlier point is that this is to import into Darwinism an absence of teleology, which is simply underdetermined by Darwinism. Street and Joyce are smuggling in their naturalistic convictions that a theist would have grounds for resisting. So for now, let's simply ask what resources from theism might help answer the debunking challenge. Okay. It feels like forever since I changed the slides. Oh, but that's right. Apparently I have got a huge gap there I've got to fix at some point. To help structure our discussion, let's quickly review 4 variants of debunking, all of which have already been touched on. We'll quickly enumerate and articulate them following the helpful classification by Paul Rizkala. First, there is the cosmic coincidence issue. Evolutionary pressures are thought to distort our moral beliefs, not enable them to discriminate between what is true and what is not. Second, what Paul calls the truth and inclusive fitness problem. Truth tracking is thought to be incidental to fitness tracking, right? What conduces to our finding the truth isn't necessarily what conduces to our evolutionary fitness, right? And if it's evolution that's shaping us, then why believe that the beliefs that we have formed in that context actually track truth? They might sometimes overlap, but such cases are rare. To illustrate such challenges, Street uses the analogy of someone trying to get to Bermuda by boat, but simply allows the wind and the waves to guide the vessel. Very rarely, the boat will end up in Bermuda, right? But most of the time, it's just not going to happen. Third, most germane to our present discussion, there is a justification problem. If our beliefs are formed by an unreliable process, they lack justification or warrant. And if our moral beliefs are formed in this way, we lack moral knowledge. And fourth, a contingency problem. Had evolution played out differently, morality for us could look quite different from how it does. Sometimes this is called the problem of Darwinian counterfactuals. Yes. Because this very question was raised by Darwin himself when he wrote this. If men, this is a very famous passage, you might have heard it before. If men were reared under precisely the same condition as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. To tackle such objections from a supernatural perspective, it bears emphasis that the central most relevant feature of a theistic picture that gets added to the mix is a rejection of the natural origins thesis and a corresponding affirmation that the process of evolution could have been directed by God, after all, and as a result be more goal or telos driven than would otherwise be plausible to believe. This directedness of the process of evolution may well prove to be just what is needed to avoid the problems of debunking. Regarding the cosmic coincidence of moral truth in our moral judgments, evolution need not have been a purposeless process in which such coincidence or correspondence was a matter of infinitesimal likelihood. God's purposeful control over evolutionary processes could ensure the destination intended be achieved. Regarding truth and inclusive fitness, theistic evolution allows for a teleological underpinning of the evolutionary story that permits and is even conducive to the tracking hypothesis. Regarding the justification challenge, if theism is true, there's good reason to think that the moral capacity does, in fact, form beliefs sensitive to the moral facts. A purposive account of the universe can both do justice to our pre-philosophical moral commitments, unlike the departures from moral realism we see in Roos and Joyce and Street, and explain the human acquisition of belief-generating and belief-evaluating capacities that track moral truth. It avoids the explanatory gap that comes from asking how human beings, developing in a physical universe that is not itself shaped by any purposive force, come to have the capacity to apprehend objective moral norms. So how does theism accomplish this feat? And by theism, I mean, belief in a self-subsistent, omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent personal deity. Maybe something like this. God knew that our possession of moral knowledge would be objectively valuable, which gives him good reason to bring it about. Desiring this state of affairs and knowing how to make it happen, he had the power to do so and took actions to this end, and this intrinsically valuable state of affairs of our possession of moral knowledge came about as a result. As Angus Ritchie puts it, a theistic explanation of the emergence of moral knowledge need not conflict with a version of the theory of natural selection. The theist need not deny that the processes described by evolutionary biology explain the generation of human convictions about ethics and their capacity to reason about these convictions and refine them. All that the theist needs to add to the account given by evolutionary biology is the claim that the world is providentially ordered so that the interaction of the quasi-teleological process of natural selection and of the spandrel-like features it generates yield an outcome which enables human beings to apprehend that which is of objective value. There's a parallel sort of reasoning when a supernaturalistic explanation is invoked by design theorists to explain the extremely restricted range of value of the fundamental physical constants of the universe, permitting the existence of living conscious beings. Their account is not in competition with that of physics. Rather, they are claiming that the physical system has surprising properties which are better accounted for if the scientific account is complemented by a higher order account in which a benevolent creator orders the world so as to achieve certain objectively valuable outcomes. Likewise, with respect to the development of belief-generating and belief-evaluating capacities in human beings. Whereas the scientific story will not explain why our moral capacities track the truth, The theistic story is, as Ritchie puts it, a higher level account which explains why our capacities have this additional property. I keep getting farther away. On theism, as George Santayana once put it, the good is also nature's creator. And it's not so much that he was a theist, but he was just sort of explaining what theism is. The theist is in a position, you see, to say why there is a necessary connection between certain natural properties and their corresponding moral properties, and an account of the developing of human moral faculties, a theistic genealogy of morals. This account allows for something akin to Street's tracking relation. We have the basic moral beliefs we do because they are true, and this is because the mechanisms responsible for those moral beliefs are truth-aimed. They're aimed at truth. The theist is in a position to offer a narrative that can explain the general reliability of those considered judgments from which reflective equilibrium takes its cue. All right. As Robert Adams puts it, if we suppose that God directly or indirectly causes human beings to regard as excellent approximately those things that are godlike in the relevant way, it follows that there is a causal and explanatory connection between facts of excellence and beliefs that we may regard as justified about excellence, and hence it is in general no accident that such beliefs are correct when they are. End quote. The great 18th century Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid appealed to a set of first or self-evident principles of morality able to be discerned through reliable epistemic faculties. There are moral beliefs to which we should pay homage, utilizing them as data for the construction of moral theories or as a kind of court of appeal in assessing them. But our confidence in these constitutional beliefs is wisely invested only in the event that we have reason to believe the faculties responsible for them to be truth-aimed. Reid's theism provided him with such a response. The moral faculties were forged in the same shop as our other cognitive faculties, designed by God for the purpose of discovering truth, including moral truth. Quote from him, that conscience which is in every man's breast is the law of God written in his heart, which he cannot disobey without acting unnaturally and being self-condemned. Almost done. On this sort of story, one does not encounter the defeater of the evolutionary debunking objection because God's providential ordering of the process amounts to a defeater. Or perhaps in the words of Alvin Plantinga, a defeater-deflector. A defeater is used to restore the epistemic credentials of a belief which is facing a defeater, but a defeater-deflector prevents a would-be defeater from becoming a defeater in the first place. All right, conclusion. This then could be the start of a broader moral apologetic case for theism, one based on moral knowledge predicated on robust moral realism. I but gestured in the direction of the challenge debunking poses to naturalists. There's much more work to do and discussion to be had about that. But if a case could be sustained that theism provides better resources for avoiding the force of such objections than those of naturalism, by principled appeal to substantive teleology and a rejection of the naturalistic origins thesis, the prospects for an epistemic moral argument for God seem rife with potential. Thank you very much.